We are delighted today to have Dan White with us. Dan is a graduate of 2002. God is a missionary God, and Dan knows that full well. And Dan is the author of The Subterranean and co-author of The Church as a Movement. He is also the movement developer and coach of V3 Movement, which is a church planting organization. And we are so glad to have him here today. It's the first time he's been back on campus in about 15 years, I think, something like that. So we're so glad to have him. Give him a great Davis College welcome back home. Would you do that?
How are you?
All right.
Things look a lot different than last time I was here. They didn't allow acoustic guitars in chapel. Yeah, for real. This jean stuff was a total sin back then. So this is good. This is good to see. It's great to see that there's been some transformation and movement. I did graduate back in 2001. I took the 4-year degree in 5 years. I got married in the middle and somewhere in there, and that slowed everything down. Just quick, my story before we get into some of the talk stuff. I pastored locally at a church at Union Center, Christian Church, and then felt a significant call to go back home, and that's Syracuse, New York. And in that call to go back home was a call to start a new church in Syracuse. And our church is awkward and different and a little weird, and we're okay with that. We meet in homes. Some might label that like a home church, but we meet in communities, and then we are coming together in a third space. If you're familiar with the third space concept, it's a neighborhood space that is a combination. We have a coffee shop on the bottom floor. On the second floor, we have some of our work with refugees is happening in that space up there. And then we worship on Sundays every other week as our communities come together as a collective worship gathering in that space. We're very neighborhood-centric. We are really present to what's happening in our neighborhoods. Syracuse is about 3.5% of the population attends church on a regular basis. And there's been some national research around these unchurched post-Christian cities, they call them, where there was a real strong presence of Christianity. Actually, Billy Sunday, who's a revivalist, preached through Syracuse and Binghamton, and a lot of movement happened from him. But now, Syracuse is in a real burnt-over state, and there has been 12 church plant attempts in the last 10 years, totaling $1.5 million, and only one has survived. And the reason isn't because they haven't had enough money or enough resources, it's because people have been there, they've done that, they're not interested. And so Axiom's story is us trying to innovate, and rather than saying, hey, we're going to try to do the same thing everybody's doing, we're going to discern and listen to what does it mean to be the church in a real minimalistic fashion, rallied around some essentials. So we don't really think we've invented what it means, reinvented the church. Actually, we find ourselves going back to the New Testament and realizing some of the gems and gold is already there. And so we've been on that journey for 7 years, learning how to love our city and be the people of God in a really, really broken and hurting place. So that's my story. And my foundation for training and wrestling with the scriptures and wrestling with professors was here 20 years ago. And I have to make sure I give credit. Dr. Snyder was a significant apple cart flipper in my life. He deconstructed some things and reconstructed some really significant things for me that I think started a trajectory of exploring what does it mean to be the church. So thanks, Dr. Snyder, for that. Appreciate it. So I'm 40 years old now, and I've gone through stages of trying to find who I am and what my identity is. If you have grown up in America, who's grown up in America? Who has not grown up in America but is learning what American culture is like? Right? If you are here, you're getting the full saturation of what it means to be here. And a lot of American culture is pressing us to consider, what does it mean to be you? What does it mean to be the self? And we hear slogans like, be who you want to be, follow your dreams, find yourself, don't let anyone get in the way of your plans. We hear these slogans, they're in our commercialism, they're in our celebrities, they even come from our politicians. This is the language of identity formation. How do you form the self? Well, according to our culture, to form the self is to self-express and become your full self by finding your dreams. I mean, this is not new just in the last 5 or 10 years. Even The Sound of Music, to quote The Sound of Music, climb every mountain, ford every stream, follow every rainbow till you find your dreams. This trajectory, this pathway, that to be you is to be the fully actualized you, fully in tune with your dreams. To search for your identity, to find who you really are, is a primal pursuit. Almost as primal as eating, sleeping. American culture doesn't have to tell you to go look for it or to search for it. You already have the engine and the drive to figure out who you are and who you're going to be, and whether people are going to celebrate who you are becoming. This is just primal. It haunts every soul, this search for identity. And it's happening here, in this space. Each of us are searching to figure out who I am. Do my peers see me for who I want them to see me as? It goes with us to our workplace and our families. Any of you had arguments with your mom or dad when you've gone home on break about stuff? They want you to be their stuff and you want to be your own stuff, and all of a sudden you're at an impasse. Have you had that argument? Anybody? Come on. Yes, right? This is the search for identity. We're trying to figure out, this is what makes me unique. The problem is that within our culture, and even within Christian culture, it's not just a world issue, it's a Christian cultural issue. Elaine de Bottom, who's a sociologist, has coined this phrase called status anxiety. Has anybody ever seen the book Status Anxiety? You got to pick it up. It's a fascinating, interesting look at what's happening on a sociological level, but what's happening actually deep inside all of us. She coined this phrase, status anxiety, and it's a nervous stress about our personal impact in the world. It's status anxiety distorts what it means for me to be meaningful and memorable and the maximized self, and it's distorting us. There's an anxiety around our status. Elaine de Bottom is tracing this inner paranoia that all of us carry, that we may not actually be all that we want to be. And we're twisted up in knots about it. We have depression about it. We're angry about it. And I have this disease as well, of status anxiety. Actually, it's kind of ironic that it was 20 years ago the last time I stood on this stage was 20 years ago. And I was accepting, at the end of the year, they give out a Christian Character Award for the person that has been the most Christian, maybe. No. But yeah, Christian Character Award. So I walked up here and received that award and felt a surge of self-worth. But little did people know, except for my girlfriend at the time, Tanya, who I'm now married to, I was a mess inside. I was a mess. Couldn't sleep. I had insomnia. I was depressed. I was not the person that was standing on the stage accepting the Christian Character Award. Nobody knew that. I had status anxiety. I had this deep, deep panic that I was not making a big enough impact, that I was not important enough, that I was not significant enough. But it's funny how no one would have seen, no one would have known. Actually, people would have believed the exact opposite. I was supposed to be the pinnacle of achievement and arrival. I got the status. So in my pursuit of status, in my pursuit of being somebody significant in God's eyes and in others' eyes, I was ruining myself. I was losing myself. And when people would tell me, it doesn't really matter what people think, inside I would say, get away from me. It does matter. I was stubborn. I was resistant. And it's not Davis's fault. Back then it's called practical. It's not practical's fault. But Christian culture can actually hide status anxiety. Under the banner of achievement and making an impact for God and doing something significant and special, giving God glory can even be a hide for the ways that we are not centered. We are not true to who God wants us to be. Rather, we're living for acclaim and attention and receptivity of how people see us and feel about us. Even the disciples struggled with status anxiety. Even the disciples who spent eons of time with God in the flesh were arguing, disputing about who would be considered the greatest. That's a status anxiety issue. They're saying, who's going to be the greatest? And Jesus rebukes them. Have you not been with me all this time and realized that the least will be the greatest? Even they, 2,000 years ago, are wrestling inside with the question, how important am I here? That is the question of status anxiety. How important am I here? And no Christian cliche can just smooth that question over. You can't. You've got to be honest. You have to start exploring it. This is often, and just to keep keeping the critique on a little bit, this is why I have a hard time with the word radical, to be honest with you. And it was just a couple years ago, I wandered into a Christian bookstore, and I don't go into often, but I was wandering around with a coffee in my hand, looking at books, and I started to pick up on a theme. That the word radical was like in almost every book. Radical possibilities, radical womanhood, radical hospitality, radical love, radical reformation. Everything was radical, and that doesn't count all the subtitles. Everything was radical. To be radical is a big thing. To do something exciting and big and bold and measurable so that people can see, wow, that's radical. We like the word radical. I like radical. I mean, who doesn't like radical coffee drinking? I would be all about, right? Radical is just more than what you're having. It seems like it's an extreme quality. And for a person like me who has a lot of passion and a lot of life, I'm drawn to radical things. But I find that my draw to being radical and wanting to be radical, and even sometimes Christian culture's pursuit of being radical, mirrors the world's desire to be seen, and that radical is us trying to outrun the horror that I might be ordinary. I might be kind of ordinary. That is the worst thing in the world, in our world, to be seen as ordinary. And even in Christian culture, it's the worst thing. So, how do we start to dismantle the status anxiety? How do we start picking it apart and pulling it apart? Well, what is interesting about the word radical is that the Latin etymology of the word radical is radix, which means of roots. The word radical really means to be rooted. That's not the connotation we have of radical. It's to climb higher, go further, take bigger risk, so that people can applaud and see. But to be radical, according to its original sentiment, is to actually cultivate deep roots. I actually think that's probably the most radical thing, when you meet somebody who's cultivating roots. Rather than living on the fringe of themselves and for the appearance of what others see, or even using slogans to exaggerate how great they are or what they're doing for God. Anybody been in that scenario where someone's exclaiming what they're doing for God, and you can tell they're living on the edge? They're not living from a place of rootedness. To be radical is to be rooted. It was about 10 years ago, I was helping a guy. He asked me to help him build a garage in his backyard. And I don't know how to, back then I did not know how to swing a hammer other than to smash my own hand with it on accident. Like, I just did not know my way around any kind of tool. So I'm like, all right, I mean, I'm not going to help you much. He's like, I just need grunt work. I just need you to be here to just help me slug stuff around. I'm like, all right. So he sketched out the blueprint, and he had this beautiful plan for it, and it's a 2-car garage within a second little story for his recording studio in the top. And we worked on this thing all summer, and we had to dig a kind of a foundation to pour. And at the end of that summer, I felt so good, like, oh my goodness, I built this thing. And I remember just a couple months later, I saw him at a party. And it's like, Chad, how's the garage, man? He's like, I love it. But it's a little bit sad. I mean, you know that beautiful tree, that big tree right next to that garage? Like, yeah. He's like, my kids climbed on that tree. We lived on that tree. And it's dying. The tree's dying now. He's like, I think what we did in all our digging and in building this garage, we dug up the roots of the tree. Now it's dying. And that stuck with me, and how seeking to make an impact and to build and to be something significant, we can actually dig up the very roots and start to kill something on the inside. Lose something. And we didn't intend it. My pursuit of Christian character 20 years ago was not a distorted pursuit. It was a good pursuit. But something was being dug up unintentionally. And something inside me was decaying. So how do we get back to roots? How do we cultivate deep roots rather than living on the edge of ourselves, seeking affirmation and approval and acclaim, not even from a stage, but even amongst our peers, and maybe even with God? We think we want God to say, good job, you're amazing, look what you've done for the kingdom. Even living for that kind of approval and voice can bring distortion and decay in our lives. Well, I think Jesus models for us, what does it mean to be rooted? What does it mean to cultivate these roots that we should not chop down? That when you cultivate deep roots, it brings a flourishing, fruitful tree. You don't have to force fruit on the tree. It just happens because of its roots, where the water flows in and out. Jesus modeled this for us in Luke chapter 6. And I'm just going to give you a synopsis of Luke chapter 6, where this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And Jesus, in Luke chapter 6, is modeling for us the prototype human. He's not just showing us what God looks like. He's showing us what does it mean to be human. In theology, they call that Jesus is the second Adam. Any of you have heard that term at all? Okay, that was the first Adam. That didn't go down so well. Here's the new humanity, the new picture of how to be human on earth in Jesus. And in Luke chapter 6, verse 12 through 19, I'm going to smash some things together a little bit and kind of skip some parts in there. So hopefully that's not sacrilegious here, but we'll see. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and he spent the night praying to God. So something significant is being seen in the life of Jesus right away. Then, when morning came, he called his disciples to him, and he chose 12 of them. Another significant thing is happening in the life of Jesus. And then fast forward, it says, he went down with them and stood on a level place. Many had come to hear him and be healed of their diseases. Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and the people tried to touch him because power was coming from him, and he was healing them all. So there's 3 things that Jesus does in that passage, but if you read the Gospels, you see this narrative over and over. It's in the entire story of the Gospels. 3 things are happening. First, Jesus spends time with the Father. So in his humanity, he's not divorced from the cosmic, universal, all-consuming, all-powerful God. In his humanity, he's not disconnected. He shows us a connection there. And then we see what he does. Right after he spends time with the Father, what does he do? He collects a little ragamuffin group of disciples. He forms the first semblance of community. I always have a hard time understanding the strategy of Jesus, because if I was God in the flesh, I would have showed up at a Roman Colosseum where I would get the mass amount of attention and say, I am God. Wouldn't you? In today's world, if we want to create a big splash spiritually, we show up at the biggest venue and make the biggest statements. Yet Jesus, God in the flesh, collects 12 people. He forms a community. It seems like the smallest, most inconsequential act when you think about it. Then the third thing he does, he takes this community and he moves outward on mission with them. They start to touch brokenness. So this community doesn't just stay as a holy huddle. They don't just say, oh, we finally have someone we understand and loves us. He says, yeah, we got that, but now we got to do something together. So there's three things that happen. Jesus is connecting with the Father, he connects in community, and then he connects outward on mission. Those are foundational elements of forming the self. They're not just the ministry of Jesus. They're telling us something about how to be human. How to be you. And as we struggle with looking at that and thinking, that's just not sexy enough. It's just not big enough. Jesus had the same temptation. The enemy came to Jesus and said, hey, in the desert, hey, I can make this thing blow up. Off the chain. I can get people to worship you right now. I can get the entire cosmic realm to see and say who you are. And Jesus defied all of it and pushed it back. Pushed it back. This is an issue of identity formation that Jesus is working through in the desert and is modeling for the disciples and for us eternally. That there is always an appeal to do something more and be something more special and get to that end, to that bigger place with a shortcut. But Jesus models for us how to be human by these three things. And the first one we see there is communion with the Father. If you're Baptist, who's Baptist in here, right, you use the word communion to talk about taking the bread and the wine. And typically that's where that word stays. It's sad because really the word communion is a way of being in the world. It's a way of saying, I know my feet are on earth. I know that it just looks like everything is physical, but I'm actually in communion with something invisible. It's a way of being here. It's a way of being with the Father. And we see that God, even in the entire Old Testament, longed to dwell with people. He longed to dwell with people. We see that from Genesis 1 and his desire to walk with them there. Is God needy? No. He just wants to be with us. And then we see this in the Old Testament version of the tent. And the tent symbolized God's presence amongst his people. The house of God, where God lived and God's people could live in communion with one another. And then we see this in John, where it says, the Word became flesh and made its dwelling among us. For we have seen his glory, the glory of the only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. That word, his dwelling, dwelt among us, is actually the word to tabernacle. Jesus in God in Christ came and tabernacled amongst us. It says that he came eating and drinking. Does that seem like a tabernacling to you? It is, according to God, to actually have table fellowship with his people. He enjoyed the laughter and the presence of being with earthlings. So, the first aspect of our identity formation, of who we are, is to work towards having communion with God. Now listen, and I don't want to step on this or throw this out the window, but communion with God is not just about your quiet time that you do for the first 45 minutes of the day, or that you went to church and had a worship experience and felt something. That is not the imagination of the New Testament when it's talking about worship, or better said, communion with the invisible God in his Spirit. It is a way throughout the day to be aware that God is present here. And that's actually quite radical to think about, because it doesn't look like God's present here. I'm just being honest. It looks like the world is burning down. So it's countercultural to begin to believe that God is present. God's kingdom is breaking in. God is present with me. As we share a cup of coffee, God's presence is here. As I'm suffering and struggling, God has not bailed on me. He is present. Communion with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit is us being invited into their life in the very ordinary way we live. It's not a detachment or a disconnection from the ordinary. It's actually quite extraordinary to be connected, seeking connection with God, having an imagination that God is available and present, even though everything is screaming and saying it's not. Even though your own flesh wonders sometimes if God is present. That's what it means to form the self. That's the first aspect, is communion with the Father. The second thing we see is community, where Jesus not only just spends time with the Father, and here's the thing that you're going to find with all three of those. You're going to probably lend towards one over the other. I know some people that they just want communion. The worship experience is all they really want. I know some people, when they get to community, they're like, that's what I'm looking for. And for others, it's all about mission. We lend towards one or the other, but that creates a hampered and fractured formation of the self. It does not make for a robust and full anchored rootedness. So when Jesus calls together a community, he's forming a sweet fellowship with people. Koinonia is the New Testament word for that. There's a fellowship happening, an enjoyment. It's happening. Dare I say, and I'm going to say, that a report just came out. Well, two reports came out. Willow Creek came out with a report called Reveal, and that came out about 10 years ago. And then a report just came out 2 years ago from an organization in Buffalo that researched 1,000 of the fastest growing churches. And they found that 4% of the people in those 1,000 fastest growing successful churches that we say we want to be like, 4% of the people said they are experiencing community in their own church. Something is broken. Something's broken. We're not forming the self by attendance or partaking in a worship experience. We have to start forming the self by being with one another, creating shared life together. Now, you may not be in a space of curating your own church, but your work to form community right now are the seeds for the future. They really are. If you're living in isolation, if you're not sharing life with others, your identity will be broken. And can I say this? Social community online is pseudo-community. It gives you the feeling that you're connected, but it does not give your body the feeling, and your mind, and your emotions, and your desires that you belong with people. Community is not affinity. Let me explain. Affinity is wanting to be with people just like me, who think just like me, who vote just like me, who look just like me, like the same music I like. That's affinity. That's not the angle that the New Testament takes on community. Community in the New Testament is familial. It's family. We're not talking about bloodline either. That's what's so powerful about what Jesus did. When people say, Jesus, who are these people? He says, these are my brothers and sisters. That was actually a quite subversive statement to say. You need to form real-time brother and sister familial community. And it's not easy. I've been living that for the last 7 to 8 years. It is difficult. For as much as we have ideals about community, we want to live in the community. We read a Shane Claiborne book that made community look amazing. It is tough. It's brutal. You know why? Because I realize I don't really like to love people that much. I love myself, actually, quite. And I love people who look like me and think like me better. So I actually love myself. Community is hard, but it forms the self. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, our greatest witness to the world is not what happens on stages or inside sanctuaries, but what happens around tables with our family forged in Christ. That is the greatest witness to the world. It's also a witness that you are forming a self in the way of Jesus. Community is a powerful, powerful social formation. They're finding Northwestern University is doing all this research around millennials related to their ability to relate, partly because most millennials are doing more relating through detached mediums than they are real mediums, like actual face-to-face talk. So they can talk about their opinions and be pretty spicy about what they believe online, but in present, they're cowards. Because they don't know how to do this transaction well. And they can give feedback to somebody online about something. They can be critical online, but in real time, if someone gives them any gentle feedback, they're crushed. They fall apart. And it's because they're not forming their self in community. And you're not exempt from this, and neither am I. We have got to work towards recovering together what it means to be together and share life together and have a common life together. Even now, the stage that you're at and where you're forming the self. The third thing we see is that Jesus takes these ragamuffin disciples and he starts to heal. He starts touching brokenness. And in the church that I planted, our initial surge of growth and people that came were people who said, I can't stand church. I like Jesus, but I don't like the church. I really want community. You know, and I kind of like, oh, I get that. I can feel that. I've been hurt by church. There's some funky things I don't like about it. Yeah, you belong here. What ended up happening for some of those people was that their worship of community, their possession of community, made them have disdain for any movement out on mission. Like, no, we need each other. We don't need to be moving. And any movement seemed like a falling apart of community for them. Because they worshipped one aspect of the forming of the self, not the whole. And Jesus shook up his disciples by taking them into settings where they did not feel equipped on mission. Just imagine for a second. Jesus tells you that he has come to heal the sick, right? He's a doctor for them. He's not for the healthy. Tells you this as you're following with him. And then he takes you into a setting where there is, back then it would be considered a raucous party. And you're like, oh my goodness, what are we doing here? This is not comfortable. And then a Pharisee, an inspector, comes up to you and says, what are you doing? Why is your teacher here? What are you doing here? You think you have answers? Like, I don't know. Jesus speaks on behalf of them. Let me explain what's happening. I've come for the sick. See, mission is not you going out because you have all the answers or you know what to do and you know how to rescue people. It's following Jesus into brokenness while even you still feel broken at times. Mission is that in that space you start to discover the fullness of who God is out on mission. And mission is overseas, but we have a vacuum of what it means to be present in this place on mission. A rhythm of being present to brokenness. And you should not delay that now. You should not say, when my education's done, then I'm going to get missional. You shouldn't. Because by that time, I'm telling you, you're going to be a pastor who has not formed the self properly, and mission is something you preach from the stage, but you don't live in your own body. This is where we're stuck right now, because we have not formed it in ourselves. The concept of mission we receive from Jesus. And this is how Jesus understood himself. He understood that he was connected to the Father, that God has called him to connect and live in community, but he was also one who is sent. That is it's on his name tag. It's not just something he does, it's a self-descriptor. So you have to discern now. You have to figure out now. You have to wrestle now, talk now, pray now about what does it mean for you to live on mission here, right now. And that doesn't mean that you have the power to save souls. It means you have the power to be present in brokenness. And then, I spent time in Binghamton 10 years ago. There is a lot of brokenness here. And I know you're taxed out, you're studying, do you still have duties around campus you got to do? I don't know if you do, I had that kind of stuff. I had to clean the stairwell or something every week. I had all kinds of excuses for why I did not have time to be on mission, because I was taxed out. Every single person in every church is saying that right now. I don't have the capacity or the margin for mission. You know who does mission? The people that we hire, the people that we pay. That is not the formation of the healthy self. These three things, communion, community, and I call it commission, these three things are the roots. These three things form a tree that is nourished and can be fruitful. I have a great childhood memory in my backyard in Bridgeport in New York, right near Syracuse. We had this willow tree, massive willow tree. And you can see the trunk is so big you could drive a car through it. This massive, massive willow tree. And I used to hide behind that thing when we did hide and go seek in our backyard, climb it. And it's just this sleepy thing that just covered. Our backyard is as big as this chapel, but the tree itself, its willow leaves just kind of covered the entire, gave shade to the whole place. Well, when I moved back to Syracuse about 7 years ago, I was curious about that tree. And so I drove home to Bridgeport, and it had been 15 years since I drove to that neighborhood. And I remember driving there, and nothing looked the same. There was a strip mall there. There was all kinds of new $250,000 houses. And I'm like, where's my house? Where I grew up here. Where is everything? I was totally disoriented. And then I saw the tree. And I'm still baffled at why that thing did not get cut down. There's a strip mall. There's all this suburbia has taken over. And I got out of my car, and I walked up to the tree and jumped somebody's fence to get in there. And I hugged the tree. I became a tree hugger for a couple of seconds. You know what it symbolizes to me? All of this stuff looks quite amazing to most people. But this is rooted. This is real. Most people will drive by and say, look at how gorgeous these houses are. Most people will shop and be like, I'm so glad there's a strip mall here and an outlet here. Very few people will comment on the willow tree. See, but that's what Jesus is looking for. It's not the things that are most obvious. It's actually the ordinary. That's why Jesus calls the kingdom of God a mustard seed, something that you would trample on and not even notice when you walk across it. There's something powerful happening in rootedness and sustaining that happens in our minds, our bodies, our souls, as we live into communion, community, and commission. So I want to ask you a question, and I want to give you like 10 seconds to write it down. If you don't write it down, I'm going to shame you. I want you to just listen. Nobody can look at your paper, and nobody's going to hold it up and point it out. But I want you to self-assess a little bit. I want you to ask a question. Out of those three, out of communion, community, and commission, first ask, where do you think, I'm living into this. This is a significant root in my life. I know I cannot do without this. I want you to write which one on the page that you're, not just in your mind, but you're practically living into right now. Which one is it? The second one, I want you to identify the weakness. I know it's good. I know I need that. I know it would be healthy for my formation and my identity, but for some reason, I'm not really practically living into it. Which one is it for you out of communion, community, and commission? I want you to close your eyes. Let's pray together. God, thank you for your deep, abiding love for us. And we know that you love us because of Jesus. We have proof that you moved out of Mount Sinai, smoke and mystery, down deep into the world in the body of Jesus. And Jesus says, I love you. So we want to soak and self-define as one who belongs to you. And second, we're asking that you would help us to cultivate roots. That the students in this room would start to stir and struggle and wrestle with how they are rooted. I ask that you would not condemn or project guilt, but they would hear invitation. They would hear belief. They would hear the Spirit say, I'm striving with you. Thank you so much, Jesus, for being the prototype, the perfect picture of what it means to be human. We love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.